However, our story begins with a kid, a perfectly normal human who somehow managed to be time traveling, and moreover, found himself in another world without knowing how he got there. A status window pops up, warning him that his health level is quite low. Ideally, he should stay put. However, the main reason for his declining health was staying up all night. And furthermore, he runs the risk of getting beat up. Yet, our protagonist looks to a corner of the mirror, where he saw specific information about himself, confused about how this mirror got installed. With a somewhat excessive force, he allows himself to simply touch it, but that touch causes it to break quickly. However, our protagonist, besides being able to see life through this mirror, started to notice that when he looks at it, he begins to see the remaining lifespan of whatever he's looking at. Now he decides to test this theory on the mirror, but another figure in the background decides to enter the bathroom. Yang decides to leave the bathroom, but before leaving, our protagonist warns his colleague not to touch the mirror, fearing he might think our protagonist's gone crazy. However, in the end, he ends up pressing the mirror despite the warning. As he warned, he simply moves forward, now needing to reach a cafe to meet our bossy woman. To understand a bit of the story, we need to go back a bit into the future. Our protagonist finds himself somehow traveling back in time, but like a magical eye. This magical eye allows our protagonist to have some advantages. Already ahead, he sees a prettier girl from the college where he lived. And furthermore, our protagonist realizes that she's a zombie cultivator. Yang looks at her, noticing that she's a 1,000-year-old zombie cultivator, and due to her injury, she was very hungry. She decides to eat, so our protagonist doesn't want to show fear here. Our protagonist simply returns to the bathroom. Now, the system inside his head asks him if he wants to run a simulator that allows our protagonist to advance just a little in time. And for each successful simulation, he gains 5 years. At the beginning of each simulation, he can choose all 3 talents or open passive dice for himself. But without thinking too much, he presses accept. By doing so, our protagonist can see a bit of the future. At this moment, he's about to be caught in the bathroom, so he joins his girl after eating a good meal. They end up going to a hotel together, where he's literally afraid, already knowing that his end will be in that hotel. He thinks his night couldn't get any better, but then our protagonist has to call the police to deal with this guy. However, he didn't have enough time because people started looking for him, asking why he spent so much time in the bathroom. So, our protagonist ends up making an excuse that he was admiring his beauty, which wasn't worth wasting time with someone like her. But the mirror he kept looking at ends up breaking, and she just drags the kid along anyway. Young invents another excuse, saying he was full and she should eat as much as she wants, but she refuses. At this point, our protagonist is quite strange, but it's free food, so he would accept it. She starts packing everything up. The 2 couples in the restaurant leave, but she's not satisfied with what she just ate there. Now she wants to eat our protagonist's meat, so she invites our protagonist to a hotel. Yang suddenly remembers his future, that if he goes to this hotel, he'll die. So he suggests the couple go to a hotel. Yang loved a hotel so much, he didn't want to go there because he knew if he did, he'd be toast. So he came up with the excuse that he wanted to hang out elsewhere. He preferred strolling through the city. She seemed to decline, but accepted walking with our protagonist, like a fleeting moment. Then she ended up dragging our protagonist to a busy street full of people selling food. Yang bought some things as much as possible because he needed to delay her, thinking that by stuffing her with food, she might literally let him off the hook. In the end, while feeding her, our protagonist almost forgot that she wanted to devour him in this game. At that moment, our girl realized it was getting quite late. He wanted to leave, but she tried to coax him into staying by showing affection. She saw that he wouldn't leave so easily. Soon after, our protagonist's system notified that our portal might now be sort of peeking a little into the future. Upon hearing this news, he simply smiled, closing his eyes, finding himself in a dimension where he could see 3 very useful talents ahead of him. Knowing that these things wouldn't be useful for anything, he simply began to look at the simulation, where he began to notice some things. While riding a bike with her, a group of troublemakers started bothering her, but our protagonist realized He didn't need to get involved because our girl seemed to handle these situations easily. But in the end, she didn't quite like our protagonist's action, so she battled him lightly. Yang opened his eyes, and the clock started ticking again, realizing he was in deeper trouble than before. Our protagonist then decided to initiate a simulation of his own, understanding and then using a martial arts skill. This time, he finally gained a skill, but while he was doing that, since he noticed our protagonist was standing still and thinking, he had the idea that she was thinking about him, but out of nowhere, he decides to think she's eating endlessly, causing her some discomfort. However, upon saying this, he sees that she didn't quite like this conversation he just made up. She tries to defend herself a bit, saying that mouths were made for eating. So, our protagonist realizes at that moment that he now needed to go back home, seeing that it was quite late. He wanted to leave, but Yang didn't give up on the idea of going with our protagonist to a hotel. Even though Yang was trying to make small talk with her, he remembered that he would literally kick the bucket if he didn't go with her to her house now. Our protagonist finds himself cornered, unable to escape. He ends up looking up, realizing that he had taken her to an internet cafe because he knew if they went to a hotel, he'd kick the bucket. He took her to a slightly better place, seeing that a hotel wouldn't do. Our protagonist wanted to gain a little mirror happiness, so our protagonist dragged her into that cafe. Then the store owner started looking at our protagonist, wondering why this couple was here. He began to think our protagonist already had a weird taste, but couldn't help but look at his brunette there, seeing that she was wandering around nervously, knowing that something could happen any minute. Our protagonist dragged her to a corner and started playing some things, but she didn't like seeing our protagonist playing like that, so she went out to buy some cold drinks. It took her. Our protagonist noticed a noise come back, and upon hearing that, he simply decided to leave. Extra in the past, they wanted to try their luck with her, but our protagonist sees that it wasn't even necessary to play there in the middle, because she simply kicked one right there. He easily jumped. Then realizing that our protagonist wouldn't be needed in the middle of this game, he realizes that he will have to be involved because these guys kind of caught on to the situation. At this moment, our protagonist grabs that wooden handle with that in hand. He starts attacking, using a skill he just gained a little while ago using that skill. Wow, the protagonist also feels each one of them. His skill here now allows our protagonist to easily defeat these guys. So after defeating them, our protagonist hands these guys over to the men. But after messing up Paula up there on the extras, she wanted to come from our protagonist feeling pressured. Our door, she loses his signal. She wanted to know if our protagonist was confident. So our protagonist, without thinking twice, and hands the phone to her. Our protagonist simply starts to see what he just won. He realizes that, after receiving some new talents, including the ability to completely eat her up with noodles. Wow, girl, I just started a new simulation right there. Then he ends up realizing that the authorities end up showing up, but even with the police here at this moment, one of the bandits tried his luck. He tried to flee the scene trying to escape. Wow, the protagonist sees that he would flee. So he arrests him again and hands him over to the police. He ended up going straight to the police station. He ended up sitting next to a police officer, but awkwardly, since he unintentionally brushed against one of these police officers, and because of doing that, the person got a little jealous of our protagonist, and what she did was send him to another world. This one doesn't lose to the other one at all. But at this moment, our protagonist begins to think that even being daring, our protagonist realizes that she's a little cute today. Even if she were to die, it would be worth it. So our protagonist asks for her contact, but she curiously asks our protagonist if in his contacts there weren't many women besides him and his family. Our protagonist basically happily replies that nothing besides her, even after playing with her a little. He returns to that place where those unconscious bandits were. In fact, he was just checking if there wasn't any bloodstain on his browser. He breathes and feels happy because our protagonist accidentally didn't close the tabs of the things he had searched before, and besides, he couldn't explain that to her if she could see that. But after a while, our protagonist notices the presence of a police officer arriving at this place. He realizes that this police officer was a policewoman. She was a woman a little older, basically in her 30s. Even being a person so old like that, our protagonist wonders if our brunette would get jealous of him if he talked a little with this 30-year-old lady here. But ignoring the idea of what just happened, he ends up telling this old lady police officer what just happened a little while ago. But our protagonist only thinks of one thing that he realizes at this moment, that his date night with our brunette would be going downhill. Because besides giving a statement to this police officer, wow, the protagonist will have to follow her to the police station. He feels sad about it, but something starts to fall to the ground. This police officer simply picks it up. This is something important because it would help this jealousy get here now. He managed to get away a little. However, he needed to be going to the police station, seems to be dealing with some boys, but can't stand them. At this moment, he wanted to be dealing with his date first. First, he says to leave that for another day, since he wanted to finish his date with her. The surgeon in this place allows our protagonist to proceed with his date. More Yang realizes that Zhang has ended up a little here, sleeping in these 30 seconds. Our foolish protagonist, who didn't quite grasp it, takes out his cell phone, then takes a screenshot of it. Immediately after that, he wakes up. Upon waking her up, he tells her that the next day they'll have to go to the police station, but she starts to have some doubts about herself. She wonders if she should only devour bad people, but for some reason, she decides not to devour our protagonist anymore. Instead, she just wants to knock the guy from this place out. But our protagonist promptly invites her to go to a certain hotel, where he could sort of bid farewell to his life. Arriving at this hotel would mean the end for our protagonist. Furthermore, he doesn't have money, so let's put it on her tab. Upon arriving at the hotel, our protagonist hands over a card. Then, he decides to ask for 2 rooms, somewhat deceived, because our protagonist wanted to get 2 VIP rooms but split them. So our protagonist bids her goodnight. After that, he closes the door, happily, as he sees that his main plan worked. However, at the door, we can see her, a bit sulky, because she had paid for everything, and furthermore, she won't be able to consume our protagonist. While she's thinking about this, inside, she feels relieved for having escaped this, because at this moment, our protagonist has already escaped death 13 times. So, ignoring everything that might be happening, our protagonist simply closes his eyes. He only opens them when another simulation starts, and he ends up catching the new bees. One of them was quite big, but our protagonist simply closes that simulation and goes back to sleep. However, while sleeping there, Jane enters his room. She simply thinks she could be looking at our protagonist and then leave. Later, in that same place, another woman appears. She knocks on the door, claiming to be from the Zombie Association, warning that our protagonist is annoyed by someone who was quite dangerous. Moreover, she had taken the lives of many people in the past. But our protagonist unintentionally got caught up in the confusion, unable to defend himself. She thought our protagonist was being controlled by that person. However, the person in the other room woke up with all this noise while the two were fighting. So our protagonist saw an opportunity in the midst of it all. He grabbed his bags and simply left the place. But for that, he invents a small plan. He'll need to knock on more doors here, but he won't die because he'll exit a simulation after kicking the bucket. Our protagonist will gain some skills, but after leaving his elevator, our protagonist runs past her. She wonders what's going on, but she just ignores everything and goes straight ahead. He ends up escaping into the street, and we can see our protagonist running. But the one from before, who was looking for our brunette, simply appears, asking our protagonist some questions. Not getting an answer, she simply doesn't understand, faints right there at that moment after removing our protagonist. She ends up throwing our protagonist to the ground. She sniffs our brunette and sees that she's bigger at this moment. She gets scared because she sees that in her past life, 11 memories come to her. She sees that she lost an extremely important person in her past life. She didn't want to lose it, so she transforms into a kind of music, a mutant zombie monster. With that transformed, she runs towards our blonde to try her luck, but ends up receiving a cut on her arm. But that wasn't anything. Using a kind of sword, she thinks of punching our blonde. Blonde starts to realize that our brunette was getting stronger. Not just stronger, but also faster. Her movements were becoming quicker, and a single slash, she ends up cutting through a pre-existing smoke. That smoke ends up dissipating halfway. Oh, the guy. That's when she notices the direction of this person who appeared right after her, then taking just one hit with that sword strike, breaking it, and at this moment, she would be defeated. But however, here comes something else. It was a beast that resembled a fantastic cat. This beast that looked like a ghostly cat. I see it here just to be helping her, because besides, she couldn't make that zombie go with our brunette stopped here. She would be able to defeat her not being defeated, because then that one would be wreaking havoc in the city. And this ghostly kitten didn't want that to happen, but to defeat our brunette, it was like this. Hey, you'll have to wait here. She ends up losing some of her power, as it will be necessary to wait for her power to run out. Our protagonist already appears holding the colorful hammer. With that colorful hammer, he simply approaches our brunette there, close to him. Our protagonist only finds that in his head, however, nothing happens. This actually makes me more furious, just thinking that he was and would be attacking our protagonist. Our pet is scared, but then she ends up fainting after having all her power sucked out. She will be losing consciousness, that now he could easily defeat her. However, our brunette falls into the arms of our protagonist, but Jung warns that they will need to be doing something. When Gina wakes up, they will need to be acting as if nothing had happened just now. But however she wonders what our door was doing, he says that he simply did nothing to make her have the power. The only thing he did was just make her lose some of her power. There, he managed to make her faint, but our protagonist needed to kind of faint together to be able to do things so that he could put his foot out of this place. Right after our door is unconscious there, he is taken to a place there, but kind of safe there inside. We can see he needed to sign some kind of contract, but our protagonist didn't create. We find him wanting to know if this contract would give him work with me and money and another, and among other things. But the main thing is that he sees that this place where we were worth it. And besides, he could be getting strong in this place, but there while getting some things after that, then she asks for that. The next day could so meet her in a certain corner, because there she would be giving something to him. This is ugly. He here earns a card from her. However, our protagonist wasn't willing to collaborate with things. For that, she will not be giving one last thing. It was a woman. However, in the blink of an eye, our protagonist breaks that lone amulet. This leaves her a little the foot of our protagonist. You stay in the background, just watching all this. After all that, asks which clan she was. But then if you laugh, this one had an appearance of an ostrich. However, she passes herself off as a rat that turned into a once sad with a human and rat body, sticking a mountain there, for its weakness is weak. She ends up hiding in her head below, because they end up kind of being answered by our own. However, a simulation already appears for our protagonist. The simulation ends up saying our protago here there seemed like a kind of beast. And besides, the beast extended the existence of many things to warn the pieces, so that people could save themselves from the period this beast ended up helping many people in the past. She gave her power to some humans so that they could turn into a kind of beast to fight against some people, but already taking a walk around the city, our protagonist sees several people appearing, but she tells the NGO that she didn't need to worry about that thing. Our protagonist, upon seeing a glimpse of the future, suddenly falls into a deep sleep. At this moment, he discovers that he will be in trouble upon his arrival after concluding his simulation. Our portal reaches the point where he might be in trouble. Young tries to find a logical sequence for this moment, but then he gets an idea in his own mind. We're going to a well-known restaurant in this place. place, but our protagonist realizes that the main problem is likely to be elsewhere, as they end up feeling something strange there. Upon checking, he returns minutes later with several large scratches on his chest. Young then realizes that this is too strange. War is the name given to the dark monster. These monsters are so strong that not even the Ayabi could fight them. They could be a defense monster against the air. At this moment, our protagonist asks Zayaba if he knows a little about War's history, and he responds that yes, but the Demon Control Department dealt with them in the past. But if they're loose in this world, they can cause a lot of damage to people. Therefore, if you come across an apex, you have only two options: fight or flee. There is only one way to defeat them: if you have a friend by your side and ask for help. He ends up having a surprise because his friend cannot see the monsters. However, when it becomes invisible, it can easily be defeated. To fight against it, they will need help by their side. So at this moment, our protagonist gets the idea to call someone for help. While thinking about it, he comes up with a small plan to catch that creature. Meanwhile, on the other side, we can already see our blonde girl waking up and receiving a message on her phone. It's from someone calling for help, our protagonist. He seeks her assistance as they need to get there to help. While talking, he sends her a photo that catches her attention, prompting her to quickly get into a car. Inside the car, she asks the driver to head to where our protagonist is. The protagonist didn't just wait for her to arrive, but our protagonist doesn't seem like someone who obeys anyone. He had the brilliant idea of entering the territory of that monster alone, thinking about entering when his beast appears. She tells our protagonist not to do it, and one of the main reasons he can't do that is that the monster is quite territorial, just as it was before. And now our protagonist at that moment simply decides to enter. Upon entering the alley, they are surprised by the raccoon they just saw. For this, we call for his pet. The creature comes running, already arriving. Our protagonist simply points to one side, and after pointing, he said that the creature wouldn't attack him because he was in a ghost form. Just standing there thinking, this monster thinks that he wouldn't be attacking. Our protagonist doesn't pose any threat at that moment, but the creature our protagonist was looking for was there. It just stood in the background watching everything happen in front of it. His pet was there, but our protagonist kept asking what to do next. Then behind him, the blondie appeared. She was surprised by our protagonist, then immediately started saying that our protagonist is one of the main reasons this beast seems like one of those reasons. One of the reasons was that our protagonist managed to complete 2 of the 3 steps necessary to summon the creature. When he completed the 2, it appeared. However, he still needed to be doing the rest. The last step was too easy. All they had to do was give the thing a name. So, our brilliant beast had this brilliant idea for a name, but our protagonist needed a really good name because his lighter with a mouse face didn't want to be called just anything. So, they came up with a new option: Pet. Then our blonde tried to come up with some names, but nothing seemed right. That's when our protagonist named himself. After giving himself a name, our blonde suddenly noticed that the creature now seemed to have its own consciousness. Now the creature could attack anyone who crossed its path, so she grabbed a kitchen knife and ran towards the little creature because her goal now was to put an end to it. She ran for her life to catch her own pet, but accidentally stepped on something that sounded like a rooster crowing. This noise startled the pet, making it jump back a bit, but behind it, there was a bottle. Despite being weak, it managed to become invisible. Our protagonist used this and approached Irinyu, who was holding a piece of wood and had something covering his face, blocking his vision. He couldn't see our protagonist using his ability to hide. Thinking he was holding a piece of wood, he swung it, defeating the small creature. A smile spread across our protagonist's face, but at that moment, they were too lazy to deal with the rest of the story. So, they simply handed the creature over to our blonde since they didn't want to deal. They gave it to her, and now our protagonist's pet was playing a game, sparking our protagonist's interest. She thought our protagonist was cheeky, but she was happy with the situation because she had managed to capture a monster she couldn't have handled alone. However, at this moment, she needed an angel, so she called someone who was in a car and received a scolding because she was taking too long to get to where she was. After a while, they arrived at the place where she was. A guy opened the door, saw the whole situation, but she wanted to ignore what they were thinking and just wanted them to take the pet away. So they handed her a cage, and she put the little creature inside. Now trapped in the cage, they were happier to have helped our brunette capture the creature. Then, he approached our protagonist and thanked her for taking care of the monster while she watched from a distance. But he wanted to know what form of payment they would be giving our protagonist, who dodged the question and started looking at our protagonist's pet. She began to ask why he was looking at her pet so much. But before she could finish, our protagonist came up with excuses, saying there had been an incident just now. Now that everything was settled, they were leaving, and they kinda needed our protagonist's help next. But our brother was unsure if they were following him, so our pet gave our protagonist a reason to get into a car. Our protagonist got in, and we see them arriving at a totally weird place, composed of 5 groups in total. The first group is the powerful but immobile force. The second group is the surveillance team. Among these groups, our protagonist will have to join only one. That will be the third group. Upon arriving at the base, they had a long conversation with Yang, so they could go to the training field, which was the first order of the day. The speed and precision of physical and spiritual verification were what they were testing. However, the next test is only the test of spiritual strength, but because it's quite exhaustive, they end up deciding to leave it for last. The skill verification test. Our protagonist will have some combat. However, he has 2 choices. The protagonist chooses to fight against another in the background, commenting that Young's skills are good. But at this moment, there's only one chance to defeat Zuzu. But for the fight to be fair, they will be fighting in a location where everything was simulated. One of the people offers our protagonist a sword. But before the fight can begin, our protagonist devises a maneuver. Then he starts running. Next, our protagonist begins to throw bricks while defending himself, and ONG begins to counterattack. At this moment, without realizing what was happening, she couldn't do anything more, so a brick hits her face. Gabby finds a can and tries to distract her by attacking, but even using her skills, she ends up being knocked down with just one kick. Then the test is over, and another person takes our protagonist for a strength test. Soon after, our protagonist recognizes that it was basically a demon who can control plants. This thing takes our protagonist to a team that claims to be very experienced. For this, these things ask them to teach some movements so that she can become stronger against the long one. But to start the game for real, they begin to tie some things to our protagonist so that he cannot move while doing a kind of thing, because the protagonist will have some hallucinations even without wanting to participate. They would have to do this. And so, the other one stayed a little watching all this happening. But suddenly, our protagonist finds himself in a dimension where he can kind of see his parents and his whole family gathered in one corner. Our brunette ends up investing in a wedding dress. Our protagonist may be quite surprised by this situation, because at this moment, he would be kind of marrying her. Shortly after having a very happy night with her, he will not only overcome the happy night with her, but also have a baby with her. But this will make the world basically a world of monsters. He will meet his end at that exact moment. And furthermore, our protagonist at the end of his death will remember everything he went through in his life. Sitting in the chair, he saw that he needed to change this thing that would be happening in the future, or something so close like that, because he was already in a totally strange house. Our brunette was cultivating while remembering our protagonist and his marriage and children. But to have confidence, will our protagonist really be able to prevent all this from happening? However, while she was thinking about this, she ended up having the memory of the man in black, while I remembered that from the other side. We can already see our protagonist removing our little mouse from that helmet. At this moment, she was quite surprised by our protagonist's level of power. He's a guy sometimes better than an ordinary guy, because if he improved a little more, our boy could easily be using his powers to affect reality, but it motivates him to want to train. But she saw that she should apologize to our protagonist for what he went through, for what he saw too. But on her cell phone, she simply took a picture of our protagonist while she was in that dream world. But our little orange saw that our boy didn't have a high power level, and this wasn't so bad. However, she already noticed that our protagonist's grades were quite good. Her mental strength was one of a kind, and even more so in this protagonist, a special banality was awakened. At this moment, he starts talking about one of his abilities. Leaving our little orange one of those abilities that he just awakened was that he can use infinite hacking for 30 seconds. This left her a little annoyed. She falls for this stuff about her dog. Our protagonist ends up kind of asking her to stay calm. His current ability wasn't that thing, but in the future, it will become extremely strong. There she was surprised by our protagonist's ability, because she realized that our protagonist kind of predicted her movements there. When our protagonist hears what she said, he simply says that one of his abilities allows him to see a little bit of my future. Our own can't perfectly live in the future, but he can see some things. Believing him, our protagonist gives her a hint. He says that our little mouse will end up sort of liking the situation where she will herself be quite injured in the future. This joke leaving her quite surprised. But as she goes on, our protagonist realizes that while he was doing his experiments, someone was recording everything. So in a few things there, with a pencil, he ends up ripping out a camera that was hidden inside. The little mouse, upon realizing she was getting into trouble, tries to leave, and all our protagonist did up to this point was literally use his ability to see into the future. He predicted that she was using a hidden camera. Furthermore, our protagonist became the hero of the city by apprehending some things there. But on the other side, our protagonist also predicted the event of our brunette dog. The other one, the little orange, you know her weak points, threw a note of tuna, making them tremble with fear. On the other side, we can see our brunette walking around a corner. As she walks around, she kind of attracts the attention of a little guy who suddenly appears behind her, wanting to try his luck. But she only uses her hour that makes this guy tremble a lot. He simply backs down, saying he'd rather be something else, running away with his tail between his lips. Our brunette simply sees that she needs to be doing some discover guy in the bluff. She was this interesting. We can see these people stretching, using water magic while There's a phone, then that cell phone figure picks it up, so I'm gonna pick it up. He ends up answering. It was literally about an event that was happening in the city. Turns around and then announces that today was the day to go to the cousin's house, because the event that's happening is right there. They are a kind of thing that sucks everything in its path, especially people who are going to the cousin's house. They are like some kind of animals there that are committing some minor crimes or sucking it. Old man, while this other one here at this moment thought she needed to be using this kind of form here, seems the spending of people. But on the other side, that our Razzia put the fox in its servants, and while this was happening on another side inside a car, we could already see our protagonist. He was behind that group of those guys who received their missions. Looking back, this figure begins to notice something strange happening with our protagonist, wondering what would be going on in our protagonist's view. The system appeared saying that some danger is about to happen, but he stays more chill, or sees that if something happens here, it wasn't about our brunette while she was talking about it not long ago. We can see she sneezed or felt that someone was talking about her. However, there the system ended up restarting again. Our door, when he sees this, realizes that the system will be showing our protagonist in a situation of who will be taken down in good spirits. He just thinks that this couldn't be getting worse than what's happening here now. So our protagonist decides to open a simulation, opening it. He ends up realizing that they are going to a certain mission where he won it. Arrived at that mission, they realized that there were some, but after researching a lot, they ended up discovering that they were actually fox hairs. But there, he totally ignored this clue. They went up the mountain, but arriving at the top of the mountain, something happened, making one of the people from his team disappear. They tried to call the police, but there's something like a rose perfume appeared, and this made our protagonist faint, causing him to fall boots there. Soon after, our protagonist would realize that everything is happening. He begins to reflect a little. At this moment, he realizes that the first rose mist can confirm the idea that another creature on the other side has some kind of ability to control the minds of other people. Although all this is connected to the fox demon, he ends up realizing that the simulation showed something a little contrary to what our protagonist thinks in a situation at this moment. But confused. But people in life give a lot of nutrients. He was just the purest stick. At this moment, he begins to think that the people on the mountain basically had some animals inside their body. But in the simulation, our protagonist chooses to keep exploring, out of the village, not inside. And this leaves one thing here. Our big boy was imagining at this moment, but confused. He at this moment starts even shaving his head. Because he was so confused at this moment, our boy was trying to connect the story, but couldn't. The background figures ended up kind of trying to wake up our protagonist, because they tried to call him by everything, but couldn't. Since then they couldn't, they ended up opting to throw water on our pro air. But he ended up hearing that they wanted to talk. But he first thinks that she just had an idea that they are going on this mission, but won't be able to come back, however. By saying this, it leaves the others who were inside this car quite surprised by what our protagonist said. He thinks that our boy didn't find some kind of fish.